we have Alex Gladstein from the Human Resources Foundation. He's Chief Strategy Officer there, and he'll be giving us a talk about Bitcoin versus Big Brother. Please give him a round of applause.
Hey everybody, thanks so much for taking the time to hang out with me and talk about why Bitcoin can be a liberation tool for people around the world. There's not a whole lot that I can probably teach you all about Bitcoin, but I wanted to talk today about the threat that Big Brother represents and what is Big Brother and how it works. So when we talk about this concept that George Orwell so brilliantly illustrated to us through his work, we talk about the idea of this omniscient surveillance state. And I think that what a lot of people don't realize is that this is so much more real than a fiction book. It's so much more real than a movie. It's actually reality for billions of people around the world today. And we want to talk about how it works. So how does a government, or let's say a corporation, build Big Brother? You know, what are the methods and tactics it uses to do so? How can we make it harder for that to happen? How can we fight Big Brother? And how can Bitcoin help? And I believe that Bitcoin will play kind of quite a key role in fighting Big Brother. So if you want to create Big Brother, like let's say this is what you want to do, right? You're some government or corporation and you want to control everyone, right? So the first thing that you have to do is control your citizens. You have to collect as much data as possible about the people in your country. And unfortunately, we don't have to run a thought experiment to observe how this affects society. All we need to do is look at what's happening in the world's largest country, in China. And I'm not here to like pick on the Chinese people, who I'm a huge fan of, and I love Chinese history and culture. I don't like the Chinese government, and I'm going to talk a little bit about what they're doing to their people so that we can hopefully avoid that fate. So in this country, obviously the largest country on earth, there's an intense surveillance and censorship operation, the most aggressive one that we've ever seen in humanity. And it's been done largely recently with advanced technology. So one of the things the Chinese government uses is Wechat. So Wechat is an app. I think it would be unfair to call it a super app. It's more like basically an operating system where you do everything in one place, right? So imagine when you look down at your phone today and you see the apps that you use for shopping and tracking your location and directions and your finances and your health. They're all different companies, right? Well, in Wechat, they're all in one app, right? So literally anything you can think of is in one place, and so many things that Americans, for example, haven't even thought possible on a phone before, like real-time loans from friends, looking at how crowded public places are going to be. You know, these things are possible on this uber-convenient app, right? Here's a young woman from Shenzhen talking about how she uses it. So she uses it to message friends while standing in the middle of a rice paddy, to pay for snacks and water in a remote village, to buy train tickets, book hotel rooms, order taxis, get takeout, and send her aunt photos. If she wanted to, she could use it to pay electricity bills, top up her mobile phone, make hospital appointments, and check the weather. So it sounds really convenient, right? It sounds very tantalizing. It's quite awesome from that respect. But it's quite dangerous because it allows the government to create basically this digital footprint of you. And that's what we want to prevent if we're fighting Big Brother, right? So the second step after they've collected all this data about you is to start creating incentives and disincentives to make you patriotic, okay? To make you loyal. So they do that through something that we might loosely call social credit. So there are some myths about social credit. It's not unified across China. It's not completely operational. It's very experimental in different cities. Sometimes it's done by a municipality, sometimes it's done by a private company. But the fact is that the Chinese government, the Communist Party, does want all Chinese citizens within the next few years to be on some sort of social credit system. This is like what they are telling the world and what they're telling their citizens. Now, when they tell their citizens about it, they say it's for their safety, right? We want to make sure that no troublemakers are around, right? We want to make sure that everybody is a patriot, someone who's going to respect national security and stability, right? So what happens is you receive a number. You're started to be graded not just on your financial history like we are here in the United States, States, where you think about your credit score as something that, basically is dictated by, have you paid your bills on time, how much outstanding debt do you have. So what they decided to do is add to that who your friends are, what your perhaps sexuality, religion, what your political views are, anything you've ever said kind of goes into this number, and then that way they can kind of like really encourage you to be very loyal, right? And this is actually preventing people from getting access to things like getting a good rate on a mortgage or sending their kids to private school or being able to access the ability to buy train tickets or flights or even get a visa to leave the country. So you're under crazy amounts of pressure to have a good social credit. And in certain cities and areas, there's like billboards with like the all-stars, basically. It's like basically the best performers are lionized, right? But young Chinese people, like this 23-year-old woman today, are not sure whether they're constructing, is this like a futurist society or is this a cage, right? And I think that's quite a powerful idea, and it's something that hundreds of millions of people are grappling with right now as we stand here. So giving you some of the other, let's say, sticks in addition to the carrots that the government offers with this new system once they've gathered up all of your financial and personal data are things like disincentives. So this is like in a town square in one particular city. If you jaywalk, your face and your ID number get put up on a giant screen. So you get shamed publicly, right? So that's like one way they can start disincentivizing bad behavior, right? This is another experiment in one particular quite large city in China where through your Wechat app, actually they've upgraded it so that you can see people who are debtors on your phone. And the idea is that you want to stay away from those people because if you interact with them in any way, your score will go down, right? So basically they're trying to make people with bad credit be pariahs. You wouldn't want to go near them, right? So this is actually operational in like a large urban area today in the world. This is not an episode of Black Mirror, unfortunately. And we talk about this idea of like, that sort of fictional idea of Big Brother. What it is not just the collection of data, but constant surveillance, right? And the goal is actually self-censorship. If you read that novel, the people who live in that fictional world self-censor. They're so afraid to say anything that might piss off the government that they just don't do it, right? And I think that's the goal of something like what the Chinese Communist Party is doing. And they're doing it not just with these like incentives and disincentives, but also with very advanced surveillance technology. So this photo is actually almost 2 years old, and it's of another one of these experiments that the Chinese government's doing, and obviously it looks maybe like a little bit like Google Glasses. But this policewoman, when she looks out at this, she's seeing like quite a bit of data about you. So it might look something like this. So this is like a GIF file from an actual company that sells its services to the Chinese Communist Party. I guess it's known as like dark tech, and they have these festivals or kind of sales conferences in China, in Beijing and Shanghai, where all the world's top surveillance companies come to sell their services to the Chinese government. And this was sort of from one of those demos, right? So they're all competing to sell their services to the Chinese government. And I think it kind of creates this reality that's so similar to the Orwellian world where, as one of the characters in the book said, nothing was your own except the few cubic centimeters inside your skull. And unfortunately, that's the reality in at least one part of China that is probably the most surveilled place on earth, and that's Xinjiang, which is in the northwestern part of the country. So what the government has done is basically take this area north of Tibet where tens of millions of Muslim minority Uyghurs live and turned it into basically their playground for experimenting with all this advanced technology, right? So this is a satellite image done by open source investigation of one of the prison camps in Xinjiang. So it's estimated that more than 1 million Muslims are being held in these camps. And what the government is trying to do is nothing less than cultural genocide, right? So what they do is they take the men and they put them in these camps, and then they marry the women off to Han Chinese people, and the children are re-identified as Han Chinese. This is like a campaign that's happening right now. And a lot of Western companies are partly guilty in this because they're aiding and abetting the Chinese government. They're selling their services. So, you might sit there and wonder, beyond getting to the later part of the talk about maybe fighting back financially, like what can we do? Well, one thing you can do is definitely tell American companies, Canadian companies, European companies to not help the Chinese government build these camps. And just to give you scale of the numbers So at the peak of World War II, the Nazi German government held 715,000 Jews, gypsies, religious minorities in their prison camps, right? So right now, the UN says that there's more than 1 million Muslims in these camps in China. The real number is probably much closer to 2 million or maybe even more. And when people, and you can read tourism testimonies of this today, when they go to these large, lively, historic cities like Kashgar, I mean, they're empty. They're just like completely empty. Like the people have been wiped out. So this is something that is kind of what is at the end slippery slope of Big Brother. So this is why we don't want it, right? But unfortunately, it's not something that's even just isolated to China. So this is a map done by the New York Times of the countries where governments have purchased Chinese surveillance technology. So it's quite extensive, and this is all part of something called the Belton Road. If you haven't heard of the Belton Road yet, I think you will by the end of the year. I think it's going to be something that's part of the US presidential debate cycle. The Belton Road is the largest infrastructure project in human history. So it has a projected budget of $1 trillion. So the Marshall Plan, which rebuilt Europe after World War II, had a budget of 120 billion, okay? So this is like much, much larger than the Marshall Plan. Already, the Chinese government has given out loans and investments of $400 billion to 120 different nations. There's definitely no human rights requirements on the digital Silk Road. Instead, what's happening is surveillance cities are popping up all over the world. So here's one in Quito, in Ecuador. So this is something the Chinese government built down in Ecuador for the Ecuadorian government. There's an amazing New York Times investigation of this recently, where a friend of mine, Melissa Chan, goes into this unit, and the Secret Service basically say, oh, you know, we can't have access to this information. And then like 3 minutes later, they catch the Secret Service like mirroring all of this footage in their own little truck. And they just catch them, and they have to apologize. So these governments are taking all this data, street-level surveillance stuff, claiming in the name of public security, claiming to use it for national stability. But no, they're actually using it to spotlight dissidents and crack down on dissent. And this is happening all over the world. And it's really, really important even for Europe. So even in the heart of Europe, there are 17 European countries, including France and Germany, who right now, in the next 12 to 18 months, are auctioning off their 5G licenses, right? So like the future internet infrastructure, right? So 5G is not just a faster internet connection. It's going to connect everything from transportation, finance, healthcare. It's really going to change the world. This is a quote from the Czech government, and the Czech Republic is kind of at a boiling point right now, because the president of the Czech Republic is the person who's really introduced Xi Jinping back into Europe, whereas the Czech Republic used to be ruled by, or rather, I guess, served by Václav Havel, who was a famous human rights hero, really, supported Tibet and supported all these different positive human rights issues. The current guy, Miloš Zeman, is basically in love, as he says, with Xi Jinping, right? And he's really brought in a lot of this Chinese surveillance technology. He even uses it for his personal communications team, which I find really staggering. But essentially, the Czech government is now in a fight with the president over this, and they came out with this statement saying that the stakes in developing 5G, which can handle almost instantaneous transfers of large data packages, we're talking gigabit speeds on your phone, can't be higher. It's a major step that will change the nature of industry on a global scale. We're basically talking about another industrial revolution, okay? And this might be done, and very, very likely will be done by companies like Huawei, and they're going to take all the data that you transmit, and they're going to have a copy in China. That's actually a law called the National Security Law there. So Big Brother is a lot closer to you than you might think, right? And even here in the United States, of course, we saw what Snowden revealed, and we've been dealing with the aftermath of that for many, many years now. But I mean, think about even in your daily life. Think about the risks that centralized data poses, not just from a, like, let's say maybe a censorship point of view, but even from a security point of view. Look at the breaches that companies like Facebook have opened us up to. This is a nice little message I received from Facebook a few months ago saying that basically, oh, my security and all my information was breached in September, like my phone number, date of birth, email, recent locations, basically where I've been, were all leaked and breached. Just wanted to let you know, But this is the kind of sloppy data, security that the biggest companies in the world are dealing with. So this idea of like having all your eggs in one basket is dangerous for more than one reason. And forget social media. I mean, people seem to have gotten amnesia about this point, but in late 2017, Equifax, one of the largest credit agencies in the country, lost apparently 140 million Americans' sensitive data, including social security numbers. So this idea that our data should be stored with a trusted third party is probably not a great idea. I wanted to tell you the story of the Danish banker who I met a few days ago when I was giving a talk about Bitcoin, because I think she represents sort of what the government and what companies sort of at the end of the day want. She was telling me that their current financial surveillance wasn't good enough. And I was basically asking her, well, to what end? What is good enough for you? And she really couldn't answer me. So, these people aren't happy with the existing financial surveillance state. They're really thirsty for your data. And they're part of this general kind of movement and philosophy that says that we need a police state to keep people safe. So when you ask yourself this question, is a police state necessary to fight the bad guys? I don't think so. I think that's bullshit. I don't think it's necessary. And I think when you look at what these governments and companies are trying to do with building a big brother, I mean, it's pretty simple. They're trying to capture your entire digital footprint, right? So they can predict what you're going to do and trace your microactivity, right? And then steer you towards being loyal and patriotic. These are the building blocks. The less information we leave behind, the easier it is for us to fight Big Brother, and the harder it is for them to build it. So that's kind of the core idea, and this has reverberated, I think, across the sort of technology industry. This is a photo of Jaron Lanier, who obviously is a really well-known visionary who helped come up with this idea of virtual reality many decades ago. And he gave a talk last year at the TED conference that got a lot of attention, where he basically said we should build a new internet, right? A new kind of internet that would allow us to be in control rather than having third parties get to pilfer and censor and freeze our communications, right? Because if we could control our own data and money, then that could possibly slow and stop Big Brother. That would be a noble, worthy goal, right? And Yuval Noah Harari, who's one of probably the top public intellectuals in the world, has similar sentiments. So this is something he said recently. If you dislike the idea of living in a digital dictatorship, then the most important contribution you can make is to find ways to prevent too much data from being concentrated in too few hands, right? So these won't be easy tasks, but they might be the best safeguard of our democracy. So he's talking about decentralizing data, right? That's kind of the idea of how we can fight Big Brother. And it's so important because the cashless world is here, right? So today, only 8% roughly, and it's a very conservative estimate, the real number is probably lower, of daily transactions in the world are done with paper or metal. You know that kids born today aren't going to be using paper or metal money. You know that, right? You know that Apple Card and Facebook Coin and Telegram Pay are on the rise. So social media networks are going to start competing with banks, and we're going to have just this obvious digital currency. I mean, this is the way we're going to transact. It already is the way most of you transact, right? And you have to ask yourself, what kind of cashless society do you want to live in? Because if you think about it, your spending habits say more about you than your words, right? So when we come to think about Big Brother and the surveillance state, money and financial networks are kind of the most important thing to secure. It's kind of step one. And this is happening. I mean, this was the cover of the Wall Street Journal a few days ago. I mean, Facebook is making a crypto asset that's probably going to look somewhat like if you mixed Venmo with WhatsApp, and it might be really convenient, right, especially for cross-border stuff, but it's also going to give an incredibly powerful tool to governments to monitor your microactivity, right? So when we think about centralized digital money and the negative aspects it brings, obviously we've talked about how it can encourage mass surveillance. And we've talked about how it has allowed social engineering in the world's largest country. It also opens the door for easy wealth confiscation, where you don't even own your own assets, and people can come up with things like negative interest rates to force you to spend your money. And of course, new censorship opportunities to deplatform people and restrict people and debank people, right? So when we have someone like Nassim Nicholas Taleb saying something like that Bitcoin's mere existence gives us, the crowd, an insurance policy against an Orwellian future, I hope you can start to understand maybe what he meant by that, right? And it's kind of like this escape hatch. It's kind of like this escape valve where we've had this traditional evolution of money where we went from barter to shells to valuable metals to coins to paper money to plastic cards that represented the paper money to mobile payments, and now we're into social networks, and WeChat's kind of like the end, sort of at the end of that fork, Well, Bitcoin gives us another fork where we can preserve that peer-to-peer nature, that bearer asset nature of moving money around, which has been so incredibly important, I think, for human existence. And if you think about all these innovations that you hear about, whether it's with whatever companies like Apple or Visa are doing, it's all just kind of tweaking the existing system. It's not a revolution. What's a revolution is Bitcoin, is this idea that anybody here can send money to anyone else on this planet with no one in between, no opportunity for corruption, no opportunity for censorship, and that's just quite a powerful concept, right? So, in this idea, I think we have to understand that it's very difficult for Big Brother to survive if you can't surveil people's payments, right? So again, your spending habit says more about you than your words. And Bitcoin really might be our best shot to create an economic foundation where we can have digital freedom in 10 or 20 years. It really might be. That's what I want to pose to you today. And think about where we are on the adoption S-curve of this thing. I mean, you all are experts and kind of like people who are really interested in the topic, but the average person, I can tell you, especially in the human rights space, in the establishment space, in the academic space, the average person is just clueless about this stuff. I mean, less than 1% of all humans have ever used Bitcoin. And for the billions of people around the world who suffer from things like hyperinflation, capital controls, price fixing, sanctions, even maybe by our government, Bitcoin is definitely a way out, right? So not everybody lives in New York, so not everybody has things like a working financial system or access to a currency that is a store of value or access to foreign markets. Not everybody has this. I would say it's actually quite a luxury, right? This is a map that the Human Rights Foundation put together, and basically what we've tried to do in a very simple sense is kind of color the countries where there's no separation of money and state, where like that function is very centralized, and those are the red countries. And no one's saying the blue ones are perfect, but in the blue countries there's more of a decentralization of money and state. So in the red countries like in Turkey, and this is something that literally happened, the vice president of Turkey had a money printing machine in his basement, and he was just printing money. So of course you might make jokes about the Fed, and I think you should make jokes about the Fed, but at least there's like this kind of like argument going on between our president and the people who make the money. In the countries in red, the president or the dictator owns the printing press, right? So that has led to some really bad financial situations around the world, but Bitcoin again gives us a different option. So just to give you some practical examples, in China today, of course, Xi Jinping, if he doesn't like you, he can shut down your ability to use the financial network. He can't do that with Bitcoin, right? So Vladimir Putin goes after human rights activists by shutting down their bank account. Obviously, he can't shut down their ability to receive Bitcoin. In Burma, the government deletes off the financial network religious minorities. They can't do that anymore. The US government likes to sanction, entire countries, which to me is a little unfair. I mean, what did the average Iranian 23-year-old entrepreneur do? He or she didn't vote for the mullahs. They live under dictatorship, right? So this gives them access to the world financial markets. And in Venezuela, it means that Chavismo can't hyperinflate you. And just to give you a little taste of what that might mean, in 2016, a cup of coffee in Caracas cost 450 bolivars, right? In 2017, it cost 4,500. In 2018, it cost 1.4 million, right? So what you're watching here is just the vaporization of savings for poor and middle-class people. If you're wealthy, you can have real estate. You can do things like you can take out a loan today from the Bank of Venezuela for $500,000 in bolivars and buy a piece of property immediately in Miami and watch your loan disappear. This is what people with capital do. But most people don't have access to that, right? So what we've seen is the complete and total economic destruction of a country. And I think this idea that you don't need an ID to use Bitcoin, it always puzzled me how we got into this space of like decentralized identity using blockchain projects. I mean, to me, the revelation was that we could transact without needing to have an ID, right? Without creating this digital profile, without creating this thing that Big Brother can use to control us. So that to me is like the really essential element of Bitcoin. And now, maybe 5 years ago this didn't exist, but I'm doing a lot of research into how people are adopting and using Bitcoin in places all around the world. I just finished a podcast series with some friends of mine where we interviewed folks in Nigeria, Venezuela, Iran, Philippines, India. And I mean, you can turn non-KYC Bitcoin into local currency in 15, 20 minutes in these places, if not sooner. So this idea that we can use this as a payment rail, as a bridge between monies is a real thing, and it's happening for many people around the world. They're using this for remittances and commerce, and I think it's only going to grow. And to give you an idea of kind of maybe how the world has changed, we're sitting at this really incredible, exciting moment where this is no longer possible. So this is like a photo from 3 months ago from Venezuela where the government literally blocked the aid from coming into the country with giant trucks in the highway. So they were like, no, you can't come in here. What you aren't seeing are the millions of dollars of Bitcoin that went into Venezuela on this day. So this arbitrary control that governments once had over things like financial networks is disappearing before our eyes. So that's why this is like quite an exciting time to be alive. And I guess without getting into the details, my proposal to you is that Bitcoin and Lightning could crack the door open, just maybe a little bit, for a world where we could transact without leaving such a massive digital footprint behind. We have the roadmap to getting billions of people on a parallel, decentralized, open economy where it's really hard to build a big brother. We have that roadmap. There's a lot of work to do in Bitcoin, on-chain, second layer, with regard to privacy. There's some amazing people doing some incredible stuff on this. People, for example, Adam Fiskor, who's working on the Wasabi wallet. I mean, these people really, really care about doing this, and there's a lot of smart people doing this. And I think what's necessary is almost like a peaceful Manhattan Project, right? So the US government was like, hey, let's get all the smartest people in the world to build bombs to kill each other, right? Well, what you're witnessing now is kind of like all the smartest people in the world without coercion coming together to make private money, right? And that's really what we need. And if we don't do it, bad things will happen, right? So we might kind of say, oh, well, decentralization doesn't mean anything, openness, whatever. Well, this is like about as clear example as I can give you of how important open systems are and how important decentralization is. This is a map at night of the Korean Peninsula from outer space. And this is South Korea, which obviously is an economic miracle. I mean, this is a country that in the 1970s was one of the poorest countries in the world, had a GDP of Zimbabwe, and where there was a super heavy-handed dictatorship in all aspects of life. And today, because of a slow evolution of personal freedoms, and finally the brave South Korean people's revolution, where they actually won power and now can throw their government out peacefully twice in the last decade, which is pretty incredible. You've got an economic explosion which is responsible for companies, ranging from LG to Samsung to Hyundai. The stuff in your pocket and the stuff that drives you around is all because of the Korean people, who are amazing. However, in the north, that is not an ocean. That's actually North Korea, that blackness there. And the only bright spot is Pyongyang, the capital. So it's just like the Hunger Games, right? So Snow is very similar to Kim Jong-un, He lives in the capital, and everybody gets to eat nicely there. And everybody has electricity, but everybody else is in District 12, right? And the only export that they have is human suffering. Now, the only difference between these two people is the political economic model. One is open and decentralized, and one is completely centralized, right? So this is the impact, the negative impact that closed, centralized systems can have on people. And I've been thinking a lot about this idea that in the same way that democracy, right, ruled by the people, is something that is a technology that humans used to wrest control away from tyrants, right? In the same way, the internet is a culmination of information technologies that started with the printing press that allowed us to wrest control of knowledge away from the ivory tower and the government, right? Today, anyone can have the whole sum of human knowledge in their pocket, which is pretty amazing. So to me, Bitcoin represents kind of the same idea, but with money. Like, we can finally decentralize the production of money, and we can actually decentralize who gets to control money. I mean, there's nothing more democratic to me than the idea that you don't need to go to Harvard or spend 30 years in finance or be a VC to play a meaningful role in the next financial revolution. I mean, people are doing it all over the world, and that's quite exciting. So I guess I'd like to end with these questions for you. Is the future of government tyranny or democracy? Is the future of knowledge state control of information or the open internet? Is the future of money Wechat or Bitcoin? Well, thankfully, that's up to you. Thank you so much.